back. This is Boomer Life on CL 650.
And welcome back. This is Boomer Life on CL 650. And we're talking about World Alzheimer Month with our friends from the Alzheimer's Society of BC. CEO Maria Howard is here, and joining us now from the Society is Rebecca Morris. And Rebecca is the Provincial Coordinator of Advocacy and Public Policy for the Society. So, Rebecca, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. First off, can you just tell us a little bit about your role at the Alzheimer's Society?
Sure. So I work with the Advocacy and Education Department at the Society, and my role really is to advocate for the needs of people with dementia and their care partners. Sometimes that means working with government. Other times that means working with people with dementia and caregivers to make sure that their voices stay front and center. And sometimes it means the Society's Dementia Friendly Communities Initiative and rolling that out throughout the province.
Can you tell us a little bit why the issue of stigma is so important in the work that you and your team do?
Absolutely. So stigma really changes the way that people with dementia see themselves and that caregivers see the people that they're caring for. We know that stigma is still really pervasive with this disease, and that language is a big part of that. We talk differently about dementia than we do about people with other chronic life-limiting diseases. One example is the phrase dementia patient or dementia sufferer or dementia victim rather than person with dementia. And of course, person with dementia keeps the person as the central focus of what we're talking about, whereas dementia sufferer really focuses on the disease and the challenges that that person's having. So language is a really powerful tool that we have at our disposal. We can either build people up and highlight their strengths and their abilities, or we can really reduce that person and that person can feel like their autonomy is being limited, their abilities are being minimized. So we really have a good opportunity right now to start thinking about the way that we're talking about dementia. There's a quote that I just love by somebody called Agnes. Now, Agnes is part of the Scottish Dementia Working Group. It's a group of people with dementia who get together to really advise all of the work that's going on in Scotland. Now, we have a really similar group here in BC that we've started that's a group of people with dementia who are advising all of our work in dementia-friendly communities. But Agnes says, we don't want to be seen as suffering from dementia. This is a term we really do not like. We are living with it and getting on with it with laughter and love, and that makes a difference. We are being heard and our opinions are being valued. So it's just one great example of how person-centered language can really make a difference in terms of how society sees people with dementia and care partners.
So it's almost like not focusing on disabilities and concentrating more on the abilities that these people have to offer.
Absolutely.
They're still people.
Absolutely.
And they're not always suffering.
That's right. Some people find that their disease provides them, opportunities to explore different areas. They can find that their disease gives them great insight into themselves that they perhaps didn't have before. So we really want to make sure that we're not forcing an experience on anybody by using the word sufferer or victim, although we do know that this disease does have so many challenges.
And for us, it's mostly from lack of education, really. So you're in a role where you are trying to educate communities and educate the world and educate society of how we can better communicate with someone who's diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Tell me a little bit about some specifics of person-centered language.
Yeah, so person-centered language is really language that recognizes personhood, that recognizes a person's dignity and really tries to support that, that has that acceptance and understanding in terms of the tone that we're using. It really gives a person agency rather than takes that agency away. I think that we're starting to really change the way we're looking at people with dementia in terms of how we're working with them too at the society, because really they are our biggest experts. And if we can change the way that we look at people with dementia and consider them experts rather than sufferers, I think that there's a lot of opportunity there.
So it sounds like a large portion of your job would be administrative and behind the scenes, but it also sounds like you get to have some one-on-one with people that have been diagnosed with dementia and Alzheimer's.
That's right. And I often get opportunities to present to the community alongside with one of our advocates, Jim Mann, who does a lot of work in terms of sharing his experience with the disease. And I think that is probably more education than anything that I could deliver or share.
Joanne, I think the other importance of language is it really reflects on culture change. And we know that if language and stigma are changed and eliminated, then people become much more comfortable with disease such as Alzheimer's and dementia, which means that then if that touches a family is going to be much more comfortable early on to ask for help and get help, rather than be very scared and almost in confusion about what to do. So by changing the culture, which is through language and stigma, we can actually get people help that they need earlier on, which will actually make the journey much more just that much more tolerable for both the people with the disease and the family who are supporting them.
And the caregivers
Absolutely.
supporting. We're going to talk a little bit about humor, and if it fits in, if it's right, if it's wrong, if it helps. Kathy, did you come across humor as in part of the conversations when dealing with your mother?
Oh, sure, lots of times. I mean, people, they don't lose those things. They just express them perhaps a little differently than they might have a little less filtered, and I'm all for that, Joanne. I mean, the more of that, the better. So yes, lots of times, lots of very funny things.
But jokes at times cannot go over that well. Like we used to joke in our house, we'd get up every morning and play "Where's My Watch?" Now we never meant that in any demeaning way. It was just simply a part of our day. Instead of brushing our teeth first, we tried to find my mom's watch, and we carried on. So Rebecca, can you comment on humor and its role in this conversation?
Yes, so I think that there's a big difference between using humor as a way that we can cope with all of the challenges that this disease brings, or as a way to find kind of light in our day, and then making jokes about dementia and about people who are living with Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. As part of my role, I'm often at conferences or working with the general public, and it's really not uncommon that the first thing that somebody will say to me when I tell them what I do is, "Oh, well, it's great that you remembered how to get here," or they'll make some joke about old-timers disease. And it can be really frustrating because it's hard to necessarily call that out, because a lot of times it's a way that somebody's addressing an area that's hard for them to talk about, or that there's a lot of stigma around.
It's their personal way of trying to diffuse how they understand it or cope with that.
That's right.
Okay.
And then what I try to encourage people to think about, if it's appropriate, is that those jokes can really perpetuate stigma. It can really cause people with dementia to feel badly about themselves. And that, as Maria was mentioning, can really be a huge barrier to getting a diagnosis or getting the help that a person needs. So a big difference between humor as a coping mechanism and then making jokes at somebody's expense.
Can you give us some examples in your mind what would be some characteristics of a dementia-friendly community in reference to language and advocacy?
Absolutely. So I kind of talk about dementia-friendly communities in terms of big C dementia-friendly communities and little c dementia-friendly communities. Big C dementia-friendly communities refers to the work that the society is doing with municipalities, the fact that we can now boast that we have the first dementia-friendly legislature in Canada, those kind of communities. And those kind of communities have organizations where people are aware of dementia, are aware of how to act in a way that's inclusive, are aware of the communication techniques that might be helpful. For example, following the person with dementia's lead, like Kathy spoke so wonderfully about. There are communities where there are physical characteristics like clear signage, accessible sidewalks, all of those pieces. But there are also things that we can do in those little C communities. And when I'm talking about little C communities, I'm talking about our own book clubs, our bridge clubs, our barbecues, our social networks. And there are a few kind of key things that people can do. One of the biggest things that we hear from people with dementia and care partners that makes it challenging for them when they first receive a diagnosis is that friends and family members stop reaching out. All of a sudden, they're not invited to the same social gatherings, and that can be really challenging for a person's sense of worth. So one of the biggest things that I could recommend is to keep people with dementia involved in all of those activities that you've been involving them in, before they got a diagnosis of dementia. Sometimes this might mean that the event needs to be a little bit smaller, or there might need to be room where a person can withdraw to have a little bit of a break. It might mean that the music's not so loud. But those are things that we can do to accommodate the person. Use intentional person-centered language rather than saying, "Hi, this is my friend Jeff, and Jeff is a dementia patient." We might say, and Jeff is living with dementia. And then participating in larger events and larger information sharing, like World Alzheimer's Month. By sharing information with our friends and family, it really opens up a conversation about dementia. It brings it out of that kind of dark, shadowy place where we don't talk about it or we make jokes about it, and instead it makes it okay to talk about it, and that makes it easier for people to get help and get the support that they need. And people can join us online, as Maria mentioned before, in a conversation about stigma, language, inclusion, and more by using the hashtag #RememberDementia or hashtag WAM 2015.
Is this an ongoing conversation, or is there a specific time and date for that conversation?
This will be going on through September Awareness Month. For
the entire month. Kathy, quickly, did you notice that in reference to when you were a caregiver for your mother, if you were to introduce her to somebody, did you say, "Oh, this is, Maria, this is my mom, and my mother has Alzheimer's"? Did you always qualify that? Or?
No, I don't ever remember doing that. I might have done it afterwards, but no, I wouldn't have done that. I mean, it didn't make sense at the time. I think a lot of people might introduce themselves that way, probably more often, but no.
And I think Jim Mann, you mentioned, who is on your board, when Jim was a guest on this show, he came into the front of the building with a sign around his neck and a little placard that said, "Be patient with me.
That's right.
My name's Jim and I have Alzheimer's."
That's right. And some people are very out and forward about living with the disease and will be like Jim. And one of the first things they'll tell you is that I have a diagnosis of dementia. And that might change the way that I'm acting a little bit. And then other people certainly would not be as open about that. So when I use the example of, this is my friend Jeff, that's just one example of how we might use language that's a little bit more person-centered.
Well, Rebecca, you have an extremely important role with the Society, the Alzheimer's Society of BC. Is there any final words on the emphasis of stigma before we wrap up?
I guess just that stigma is a really challenging thing to talk about. We can't sort of take our finger and point, this is what stigma looks like. We can't necessarily see it in that way. But really all of the pieces that I've sort of talked about today, language, dementia-friendly communities, all of that boils down to one thing, and that's really just being a little bit more empathetic, being a little bit more compassionate so that we can build communities across BC that are more inclusive.
Rebecca Morris is with the Alzheimer's Society of British Columbia. She is the Provincial Coordinator for Advocacy and Public Policy. Thank you for joining us and your input today, Rebecca, and the story of the journey of dementia, which will continue on Boomer Life. Coming up next, we get to have a chat with a tireless advocate and fundraiser. We could likely dedicate an entire show to this woman as well and her achievements, but we'll keep it short and sweet and zero in on the next big fundraiser for the Alzheimer's Society of BC, which will be the Mount Kilimanjaro Grouse Grind. And all of that coming up next on CL 650.
Celebrating the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CL 650.